The photograph was taken in 4 seconds. 4 seconds. And it became the most reproduced image in the history of photography. 6 men, Marines, raising a flag on the peak of a volcanic mountain, their bodies straining against the wind, the flag catching the sky behind them. A moment frozen in time, halfway through one of the bloodiest battles the United States had ever fought. But here is what the photograph does not show. It does not show the 6,800 Americans who would never come home from that island. It does not show the 21,000 Japanese soldiers buried alive inside its tunnels and caves. It does not show the boys, some of them just 17, crawling through black volcanic sand while machine gun fire tore the air around them. It does not show the Navy corpsmen who sprinted across open ground to reach a dying Marine, again, and again, and again, and again, until the day he himself was shot. It does not show the Japanese commander who sat in an underground bunker 30 feet below the surface and wrote to his soldiers that they were not expected to survive, only to take as many Americans with them as they could. The photograph shows a moment of triumph. This is the story of everything that came before it and everything that came after. This is the Battle of Iwo Jima. If you drew a straight line from Tokyo to the American bomber bases in the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, that line would pass directly through a small volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 8 square miles. No trees, no rivers, no fresh water. Black sand beaches made of volcanic ash so fine it swallowed men's boots with every step. The air smelled of sulfur. The ground was warm to the touch, because underneath it, volcanic heat still moved through the earth like a slow underground fire. The island's name, Iwo Jima, meant in Japanese, Sulphur Island. It was, by every measure, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. But in the winter of 1944, it was the most strategically important 8 miles of rock in the entire Pacific War, and both sides knew it. For the Americans, Iwo Jima was a problem and a prize. American B-29 Superfortress bombers, flying from the Mariana Islands, had begun their strategic bombing campaign against mainland Japan. But the journey was long, nearly 3,000 miles round trip, and the B-29s had to fly it without fighter escort. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima were intercepting them. Radar stations on the island were radioing ahead to warn the Japanese mainland of incoming raids, giving them hours to prepare. If the Americans took Iwo Jima, they would eliminate that threat. They would gain an emergency landing strip for damaged B-29s limping home from Japan, and they would have a forward base from which fighter escorts could reach the Japanese home islands, changing the entire complexion of the air war. For the Japanese, Iwo Jima was the last line before the homeland itself. Lose this island, and the Americans would be within striking distance of Kyushu. The island had to be held, at any cost, by any means. The man, in letters to his family, written in a style almost unbearably tender for a man preparing to die, he described the Americans as formidable enemies who must not be underestimated. He ordered his men to dig, not foxholes, not simple trenches, a subterranean city. Over the following months, 21,000 Japanese soldiers excavated more than 11 miles of tunnels beneath the island, at depths of up to 30 feet below the surface, beyond the reach of naval bombardment. They built chambers large enough to hold hundreds of men, medical rooms, command posts, artillery positions connected by underground passages, spider holes, covered pits that could be opened from below, positioned to allow a single sniper to fire, and then vanish back into the earth. Every position was mutually supporting. Every approach was covered by at least 2 firing lanes. Kuribayashi's orders to his men were simple and devastating in their finality. There would be no surrender. There would be no retreat. Every soldier would kill at least 10 Americans before he died. Banzai charges were expressly forbidden. They were wasteful. His men would fight from their tunnels. They would make the Americans pay, in blood, for every inch. By the time the Americans arrived, Iwo Jima was ready. On the morning of February 16, 1945, the largest naval armada ever assembled for a single island assault gathered off the coast of Iwo Jima. Almost 800 ships, 70,000 Marines. For 3 days before the landing, American battleships, cruisers, and carrier aircraft pounded the island. Nearly 22,000 shells. wave after wave of bombing runs. Reporters on the ships wrote that the island seemed to be on fire, that nothing could survive that bombardment. They were wrong. Almost everything did. Deep in their tunnels, their carefully engineered, deeply reinforced tunnels, Suribachi's men waited. On the morning of February 19th, American Marines would clear a position, kill every Japanese soldier visible, move on, and then take fire from that same position minutes later, because the Japanese had emerged from tunnels behind them, reoccupied the fighting holes, and resumed firing. The island was not just defended, it was alive. Flamethrower teams became the most critical weapon in the American arsenal. They could not simply shoot into a tunnel entrance. They had to approach it in the open and insert fire directly into the opening. The men who did this were not heroes in the abstract sense of the word. They were young men doing a job that required them to walk toward gunfire, knowing that if the man in the tunnel fired first, they died. Many of them did die. On February 20th, the second day of the battle, Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas was moving through a trench system with 3 other Marines when 2 grenades landed in the trench. He had 1 second to decide. He threw himself on both grenades, pulled them under his body, and waited. Both grenades detonated. He did not die. Not exactly. His body absorbed the blast in ways that should have been unsurvivable. Shrapnel fragments driven into his flesh, his lungs, organs damaged, bones broken. But a malfunction in one of the grenades limited the explosion enough that what should have been death was instead a catastrophic wound. He was 17 years old. He survived 30 surgeries. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, making him the youngest recipient in World War II. He lived until 2008. When asked later in life whether he would do it again, he said he would, without hesitation. Not because it was the brave thing to do, but because those were his men, and he wasn't going to let them die. That is who was fighting on that beach. Mount Suribachi dominated everything. It rose 550 feet from the southern tip of the island, a squat, ugly, extinct volcanic cone that provided the Japanese with a perfect observation and firing position over the entire landing area. As long as Suribachi was in Japanese hands, every Marine on the beach was visible and vulnerable from above. Taking it was the first objective. It took 4 days. 4 days of fighting, up a slope no larger than a few city blocks, losing men at every step. On the morning of February 23rd, 4 days after the landing, a 40-man patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They found a length of pipe, a water pipe, roughly 8 feet long, and attached to it a small American flag. They raised it on the summit. The men on the beach below could see it. Ships in the harbor could see it. A Marine on the beach later described the sound that went up from the landing area, thousands of voices, as something he had never heard and never heard again in his entire life. But the flag was small. A second flag was found, larger, and a second patrol was sent up to replace the first. It was this second raising, the replacement flag, that Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal photographed. He almost missed it. He had been climbing the mountain and nearly turned back. He reached the summit, saw the men preparing to raise the flag, and had only seconds to set up his shot. He did not look through the viewfinder. He held the camera up and shot by instinct, hoping the framing was right. It was more than right. The image, 6 men, 2 of them with their faces completely obscured, all of them straining upward together toward the sky, was transmitted to newspapers across the United States the following day. Within weeks, it was everywhere. It became a postage stamp, a poster, a bond drive icon. It became, within months, the most printed photograph in history. But here is what almost no one knew then, and what many still do not know today. 3 of the 6 men in that photograph were dead within a month. Sergeant Mike Senyk, the steady, respected NCO who had told his men to follow him, and they'd be okay, was killed by an American mortar fragment 2 days after the photograph was taken. Corporal Harlan Block, a Texas boy, just 21 years old, was killed the same day, just hours after Senyk. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, a Kentucky farm kid, 20 years old, the youngest of the 6, was shot by a sniper 3 weeks later. The 3 survivors, Ira Hayes, Rene Gagnon, and John Bradley, were pulled from the battle, sent home, and thrust into a bond drive tour that none of them wanted and none of them could escape. John Bradley almost never spoke about Iwo Jima again. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to the reporters who came to his door for decades, asking him what it had felt like, what it had meant, what he thought about the photograph. He had buried what he saw on that island somewhere he could not reach, or did not want to. While the flag was being raised on Suribachi, the battle for the rest of the island was just beginning. The northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima, a plateau of ridges, gorges, and volcanic rock, was where Kuribayashi had concentrated his main defensive strength. The tunnels here were deeper, the positions more elaborate, the terrain more brutal than anything the Marines had yet encountered. This was the part of the battle that did not make the famous photographs. The Marines called the terrain by names that told you everything you needed to know. The Meat Grinder, the Amphitheater, Turkey Knob, Hill 382. These were not names given by cartographers. They were names given by survivors, by men who had watched other men die on these pieces of ground and needed some way to talk about it. The Meat Grinder was a complex of interlocking Japanese positions that created overlapping fields of fire so complete that approaching any one of them exposed attackers to fire from all three. Marines would assault one position, take it at enormous cost, then find themselves pinned by fire from the others. It was not a battle. It was a systematic machine for killing. Kuribayashi moved through his tunnel system, visiting his men, issuing orders, maintaining control of a battle that the Americans had assumed they were winning simply because they were still advancing. He sent radio messages to Tokyo that mixed tactical updates with something almost poetic in their finality. He did not expect rescue. He did not expect reinforcement. He was asking his men to die, not for victory, because victory was impossible, but for time. For the delay that each day of fighting imposed on the American timetable. For the lesson that every dead American would teach future American planners about what it would cost to invade the Japanese home islands. Some historians argue that the ferocity of Iwo Jima's defense, and the casualty rates it produced, was a direct factor in President Truman's decision to use atomic bombs against Japan rather than launch a land invasion. The logic was brutal and simple. If an 8-square-mile island of no inherent value cost nearly 7,000 American lives and 20,000 wounded, what would the invasion of Kyushu cost? The answer, according to American military planners, was somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. That calculation, made in the tunnels and ravines of Iwo Jima, cast its shadow over everything that followed. But in the moment, in February and March of 1945, there were only men fighting and dying on a sulfur island in the middle of the Pacific. On both sides, the Japanese soldiers in those tunnels were not abstractions. They were people, with families, with names, with letters they had written and would never send. The tunnels contained no water for washing. Rations were running out. The wounded had almost no medical care. The air in the lower tunnels grew thick and hot and close. And still they fought. War in the tunnels of Iwo Jima had stripped away everything: nationality, ideology, clarity of purpose, and left only the most basic human experience: survival in darkness. One moment at a time. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, 36 days after the first Marines hit the beach. The final Japanese resistance was not a dramatic last stand. It was a night attack. Roughly 300 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, most of them armed only with whatever remained, who launched a final assault in the pre-dawn hours against American positions near the airfields. It was the kind of charge Kuribayashi had forbidden his men from making for 35 days. The kind of charge he had known was suicidal. But the battle was over. The time for tactics was past. Kuribayashi himself was almost certainly killed during this final action, though his body was never definitively identified. His subordinates reported that he had dressed himself in full uniform, removed his insignia of rank, and gone out to fight with the men he had commanded, and whom he had ordered, one by one, to their deaths. The numbers from Iwo Jima are staggering in a way that simple recitation cannot fully convey. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers on the island, fewer than 1,100 survived the battle. The rest were dead. Most of them remain buried there today, in the tunnels and caves that became their tombs. because the terrain makes recovery impossible. Of the approximately 70,000 Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, 6,821 were killed. Nearly 20,000 more were wounded. Among the dead, Sergeant Mike Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley. 3 of the 6 men in the most famous photograph in the world. Among the survivors, men who would spend the rest of their lives carrying what they had seen and done and been unable to prevent. Ira Hayes, a Pima Native American, one of the photograph's 3 survivors, returned home to a country that hailed him as a hero and then systematically failed him. He struggled with alcoholism for the rest of his life, a struggle inseparable from what he had seen on Iwo Jima and from the guilt he felt at being celebrated for a photograph while the men he loved were buried in a Pacific island. He died in 1955, at 32 years old. René Gagnon also struggled. The fame of the photograph had promised something it could never deliver: an escape from ordinary life, a permanence of recognition. But fame is not a livelihood. He died in 1979, largely forgotten. John Bradley went back to Wisconsin and became a funeral director, as he had always planned. He built a life. He raised a family. He did not talk about Iwo Jima. He did not talk about the Navy Cross. He put it somewhere deep and quiet inside himself, and closed the door. His son James found letters after John Bradley's death. He found the Navy Cross tucked away in a box. He began to research, and what he found changed not just his understanding of his father, but of the entire mythology surrounding the photograph. Because here is the final, complicated truth about the flag raising on Iwo Jima. The photograph was real. The moment was real. The sacrifice it represented was real. But the story built around it, the triumphant narrative, the 6 heroes, the clean arc from darkness to light, was constructed afterward by people who needed it to mean something simple. The men in the photograph did not feel like heroes. They felt like men who had survived. Temporarily, while better men than them had not. They felt the specific weight of being alive when others were not, and the specific cruelty of being celebrated for a moment that was, to them, just a moment, while the 36 days around it went unwitnessed, uncommemorated, unspoken. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz said something about the men who fought on Iwo Jima that has become one of the most quoted statements in American military history. He said, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." He meant it as praise, and it was. But it was also something else. It was an acknowledgement that the men who fought on that island were ordinary human beings, not mythological heroes, but real people with real fear and real doubt, who were asked to do something extraordinary, and who did it anyway. That is the harder truth. Not the simplified story of heroes and triumph, but the full story of young men sent to a sulfur island at the edge of the world, fighting an enemy that had chosen death over surrender, in tunnels and ravines and black volcanic sand, one terrible yard at a time, and winning, because they kept going, because there was nothing else to do. Today, Iwo Jima is called Iwo 2, its original Japanese name, restored in 2007. It remains a Japanese military installation. The tunnels are still there, still containing the remains of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Every year, delegations of Japanese and American veterans, and later, their children and grandchildren, return to the island together, to walk the black sand beaches, to stand on the slope of Suribachi, to remember, there is no single clean lesson from Iwo Jima, history that honest rarely has one. What it offers instead is testimony of what human beings are capable of doing to each other and for each other, of the distance between the story we tell about a war and the war itself, of the men who lived inside the photograph, not as symbols, but as people. 6 men raised a flag on a mountain. 3 of them were dead within weeks. The island cost nearly 7,000 American lives. It cost 20,000 Japanese lives. And somewhere in its black volcanic tunnels, a general dressed himself in his full uniform, removed his rank insignia, and walked out to die with his men, because he was out of any other choice. All of that is Iwo Jima. All of it. This has been Frontlines Untold. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone. Every life remembered here deserves to be known. We'll see you for the next one.